Welcome to the center of political life. You are now in Ottawa, the national capital of Canada. Take a good look around. Some buildings are simply bricks and mortar. These buildings represent the base of our democracy. They symbolize a gathering place of our thoughts, our plans, and our needs. Here is the starting point, a birthplace on a timeline of the life of our nation. People from all over Canada come here to talk, meet, share ideas, and provide direction for all Canadians from coast to coast to coast. You're about to see from a tourist perspective what lays behind these walls and doors of what is commonly referred to as the Centre Block. This is the main building and the center of attention on Parliament Hill. There are 5 main areas where we will visit. They are the House of Commons, the Senate, the Library of Parliament, the Memorial Chamber, and the most outstanding feature of the building, the Peace Tower. Just outside the House of Commons is the foyer. During the time when the government is in session, this area is a hive of activity. The foyer is outside the chamber, where the members of Parliament enter or exit the House of Commons. This is an ideal location for journalists and media to congregate and hold interviews with the ministers, party leaders, and other members of Parliament. The chamber in the House of Commons seats 308 members of Parliament who represent constituents nationwide. This is where MPs meet to transact the nation's business. The chamber is a place rich in tradition and offers the drama of heated debates. Within these walls, the members investigate all national, local, and legislative matters and accordingly introduce, examine, and revise legislations.
Because it's a Sunday and the houses aren't sitting, we do get to see everything today. We'll get to see the House of Commons, the Senate, the Library, so it's the full meal deal in terms of the tours. There are a few rules I have to go over before we get started. First of all, cameras, video cameras, no problem whatsoever. The only thing that I ask is that you stay together as a group. We do need to stay together as we're going through the building. As well, if you could just take photos while I'm talking, if you want to take photos of a room. I won't be offended. It'll keep us from getting a little too backed up in terms of the tour. If you have questions at any time, feel free to ask. It's no problem whatsoever. And equally, I'm also required to say no eating, drinking, or smoking on tour. I've never had a and I've been giving tours here for 3 years, but I do have to say it, so got that out of the way. As we're going through the building, I like to look a bit at the art and the architecture in the building, the history of Canada, and how we can see symbols of Canada represented in the buildings. But obviously, if you have questions on any topic, please feel free to ask. As well, I always like to ask before we get started to find out where everyone's from, because public tours are normally pretty diverse. So I'll start with the mini share session. I'm not from Ottawa. I'm from British Columbia, from Kamloops, BC, anyone who knows it. And so where are you guys all from?
Toronto.
From Toronto?
Vancouver.
Vancouver? More
Vancouver.
BC. Vancouver? Great. Anywhere else?
Montreal.
Montreal? And Ottawa, I heard? Both? Yeah. Great. And from Japan, so from outside of the country. Great. So as you can see, that's what makes the tour a lot of fun. So if you're unsure of anything I'm talking about at any point, just feel free to ask for clarification. Are there any questions? No, I assume not, but I should ask. Before we go on upstairs, I wanted to talk briefly about these plaques, just to explain them. They represent the different sessions of Parliament here at Parliament, but this time the Parliament means the period of time between 2 elections. So how often do we normally have elections in Canada?
Every 4 years?
4 years. In the Constitution, it says we have to have them every 5 years at least. On the plaques, or regularly, we see normally every 4 years, like for example here, 80 to 84. But because of the way our system works, it's not set elections as in, say, the United States. It's when the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General and asks for Parliament to be dissolved. So that means that you can sometimes find, say in a minority government situation, a Parliament that'll last not even a year long. So you'll see that the dates all vary a lot on the plaques. So we look at, say, this one. 31st means it was after Canada's 31st election. It was the 31st Parliament. The name right here, Joe Clark, would be the Prime Minister. And what's also interesting is because our Prime Minister, it's an elected position, but not a directly elected position. Our Prime Minister is the leader of our governing party. So that means that if the leader of the governing party changes, such as just a couple of years ago with Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin of the Liberal Party, you can actually have 2 Prime Ministers without there actually having been an election. And that's why you'll sometimes see multiple names on these plaques as well. All the names we see here are all of our elected representatives. So our elected representatives who sit in the House of Commons, the Green Chamber, which we're actually probably going to be seeing in less than 10 minutes as we're going on the tour. And so what I just wanted to point out briefly with the names here is each of these names represents a constituency or an area of Canada. The way that they figure out the number of people we should have in the House of Commons is a system of representation by population. This basically means that each constituency or each person here represents 100,000 Canadians. Now the best visual that I can give you of that is if you look at the older plaques, you can see there are lots of names on the plaques, but if you look at the more recent ones, there are even more names on the plaques simply because they've added more seats to the House of Commons. Originally, first Parliament in Canada, or Confederation, 1867, we had 181 seats in the House of Commons, and today we have 308. So we've added a lot to the House of Commons, and you'll see that when we get there. It's starting to get pretty full. Any questions? We're good? Okay, well then follow me, please. Let's head on upstairs to the House of Commons foyer. And I'm sure many of you recognize this area, just simply because this is where a lot of the interviews happen after question period, after the debates. This is normally where you see the politicians on the nightly news for their commentary. So this is normally where the media literally stakes out or waits for the members of Parliament as they come out of the doors here from the House of Commons after their debates. And I can tell you that generally when you see the scrum in full swing, it's almost impossible to walk through this room. It's just so full of people. And you've got the lights flashing and the cameras going and the microphones, and it's normally very, very busy. Now, because it's Sunday, as I mentioned, Parliament is sitting where you're going to come here on tour, which is great because it's probably one of the best examples of the art and the architecture that you're going to find here at Parliament. So, some of the basics. First of all, what style of building is this in terms of architecture? It's a neo-Gothic building. It sort of plays upon a lot of the architectural characteristics that we find in cathedrals, say in Europe, or those other types of buildings. The pointed arches, the very high ceilings, the large windows that on a sunny day let in a lot of natural light. You see all of these characteristics in the building, and it's all part of that style of architecture. Now, neo-Gothic architecture isn't a typically Canadian design. It's not even a typically North American design. But the reason that the architects chose this type of building is they thought that it gave the building an air of authority and importance, and it made it stand out from the rest of what we see in terms of downtown Ottawa. What they also did when designing the building is they worked for the most part with Canadian materials. So this building here, the speckled stone that we see the columns, the building is made out of a Tyndall limestone, the inner part is at least, that comes from Manitoba, so the next province over to the west. The floors here, the marble floors, are made out of marble from Quebec, so the next province to the east. So it's neat to think that a lot of the materials in this building that's supposed to represent Canadians are actually coming from different parts of Canada. Now the other really neat thing with the design, particularly with constructing the building, was that they really envisioned a huge, imposing, authoritative building that could be filled with the art and the history of Canada in the walls. Now the problem is, this building was finished in 1922. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it was finished in 1922. Canada's not a young country now. It certainly wasn't a young country. It wasn't any, older back then. And so what they actually decided to do was, because most of the history of Canada hadn't even happened, they left huge spaces of the building empty, so that as time continued, they could add more sculpture to the building, they could add more stories to the building. The whole idea was that the building would be able to grow with the country. So imagine if it was, say, 1922 when this building was finished. Most of the sculpture you see here didn't exist. In fact, most of the ornamentation you would have seen would have just been up on the ceiling. It's called the History of Canada series, and it covers over 2,500 years worth of Canadian history. And it does it by taking different blocks or chunks, and it's divided into different themes. So the first theme over here is where we see an Inuit man teaching his son how to hunt polar bear. And so that there is talking about just like the lifestyle of the First Nation. We can also see the next panel talking about the theory that they first came to Canada by crossing the Bering Strait into now what is Alaska and the Yukon. A lot of the panels over here talk about the discovery of Canada by the French and the English, talking about different developments in terms of Canada's colony. Over here we can see a man chopping down a tree with the railway behind. Once again, it's talking about how important the railway was in terms of linking such a large country together, the construction of the railway and how it shaped the country. These panels here talk about the developments of trade and commerce in the colony of Canada. And also over here, the fourth panel, you can see a man hunting for gold. So that's 1898, the gold rush in northern British Columbia and in the Yukon. So you can see all sorts of different panels talking about different elements of Canadian history. Certainly not Canadian history in its entirety, but about 2,500 years worth. The other interesting aspect about this History of Canada series was that it took 13 years to sculpt, start to finish. Because it was done in the 1960s, 1970s, it was while Parliament was sitting. So at that point in time, most of the sculpture here was done in the evening. The sculptors would have their scaffolding set up and their lights, and they would work throughout the night. Now, Eleanor Milne was the Dominion sculptress at the time who basically initiated and oversaw the entire project. And she said that one of her favorite memories of working on the sculpture series was when Trudeau was Prime Minister during part of the time that she was working on this. Apparently he used to haunt the building at night to sort of see what was going on, see what people were doing. And apparently he was just fascinated with this project. He thought it was just fantastic. And he would spend his evenings sometimes just hopping up on the scaffolding, you know, sitting there and talking with Eleanor Milne and just asking questions. How are you doing this? What is this going to be like? How is it going to work? And if you listen to interviews with Eleanor Milne, she would say, wow, I was so amazed that the Prime Minister would sit and talk with me while I was doing my work and that he would just take some time to be interested. Whereas at the same time, there were interviews of Trudeau saying, I was just completely enamored with the fact that I could sit with such a fantastic artist and pick her brain for a little bit of time. So a little bit of mutual admiration in terms of the project. Are there any questions? Okay. Well, then follow me to this would be, government side. So this here is the House of Commons. Feel free to take a look at the windows, and we can't go in sadly, but take a look at the windows. I can stand behind. It's a lot more interesting to look at the room, so then I can explain everything to you. So this is the first chamber in our bicameral system. Bicameral system, a fancy way of saying that we have two chambers. So the House of Commons here, all the names that we saw on the plaque downstairs, this is where all of those names sit, where all of the members sit. We have 308 members here in the House of Commons. They all represent a different region of Canada. Every Canadian citizen has a member of Parliament that represents them. And this is where normally most bills, ideas for laws, get introduced, where the debate happens. Now, this is where the key players that you normally see in the media sit in terms of how our parliamentary system works. So the Prime Minister, the head of our government, sits here. He sits in the first row on the left-hand side, if we count from the opposite end of the room. So he sits on the government side, which is the left. So we have the Prime Minister's seat and the 11th chair. Around him, in the first and second rows, are where you're going to find his cabinet. And I always refer to that almost sort of as like a posse. He has special members of Parliament who he selects to look after certain portfolios, like defense or health or foreign affairs, those types of things. Now on the opposite side, as it would make sense, we have the opposition. So all of the parties that don't form the government sit on this side. Now what you'll find is the leader of the opposition, which is the leader of the party with the second largest number of seats in the chamber, he sits in the first row as well. And he sits in the chair directly across from the Prime Minister. So it's tradition that they're always face to face in terms of how the debates happen. Now around the leader of the opposition, we find the shadow cabinet. And I once again make the reference sort of like the leader of the opposition's posse. But what we basically find is, the best analogy I can give is a basketball game. When you have a check, you make sure that one person doesn't get to the hoop. Same idea here. You'll have a critic for each minister. So a minister of health, a critic for health. The critic is the one that's going to be watching those debates, following the policy procedures, making sure that everything's going smoothly and that essentially the minister is doing their job. What you'll also find here in the chamber, can anyone tell me who sits in the large throne at the other end of the room? Exactly. The Speaker of the House of Commons is basically the moderator of all the debates. He decides who can speak, for how long they can speak, and if anyone's acting unparliamentary, he's the one that can also send them from the room. The interesting aspect of the position of the Speaker is that the Speaker of the House of Commons is actually an elected member of Parliament. what they do on the first day back of any new parliamentary session, or actually every new parliament, is they'll have a secret ballot in the House of Commons, and all the members of Parliament who have been democratically elected by their constituents are able to elect their own speaker. So when you think that the speaker has actually been elected twice for his position to be in charge of the chamber. Are there any questions about the House of Commons?
Is there a question period tomorrow?
Tomorrow? No, this coming week is a constituency week, so the members of Parliament are all back in their constituencies for the week. But it will start next Monday.
Okay.
Yeah.
What will they do as the population keeps increasing? Are they eventually going to run out of room?
Yeah, basically the room is at capacity now, because it wasn't this past election, but the previous one that they redrew the ridings and they added 7 new seats, or 7 new seats. Anyhow, so what you find is there's a few options. We don't know what they'll end up doing. In England, for example, they got rid of a lot of the desks, so it's like benches, and there isn't room for everyone. Sometimes you're stuck standing in the back, rows. Also part of the term backbenchers. The other thing they could do is they could change the representation. So instead of maybe 100,000 people, it'll be 125,000 people per riding. But it isn't something they've officially developed a policy on that I know of yet. But it'll be interesting to see what they decide.